They say the sea itself turned glassy on the day the bells rang for their marriage. The wide green waters below the Red Keep stilled, as if listening when the prince and the lady of Driftmark swore to be each other's. A court astrolabe keeps notes of such things, and one of its keepers recorded that the smoke from the dragon pit chimneys drew no line in the sky that morning, and that the wind off the Blackwater smelt like pears. Those who were paid to remember wrote of silks and jewels and banners like rivers of flame running from the castle heights to the September. A baker's apprentice carried rolls to the kitchens and later bragged he saw the groom laugh and throw coins to the crowd. It was the first time anyone at the capital heard that laugh carry all the way to the stables. The prince had spent too many years as a second son, and the sea-born bride had spent too many more with sailors for brothers and a grandmother who ruled her island as she pleased. When the septon pricked their fingers and set both to touch the fire, 2 stones were warmed, 2 eggs brought from Dragonstone's vaults wrapped like newborns in velvet, and a page whispered, perhaps too loudly, that both would hatch in the same year. There are letters from a midshipman to his mother in Driftmark that tell how his lady of the sea moved through the capital like a gull through wind, all quickness and light, and how the king's brother became himself only when his wife laughed with him. The letters worry for her, too. A city house will drown a sea-born girl, he writes, and implores his mother to send her more shells and salt-dried seaweed, because she keeps them in bowls and insists the smell is a ward against restless dreams. On Dragonstone, the dragon keepers laid a pale egg in her brazier and taught her to hum a low note they said dragons liked. A yard boy polishing spears on the hill wrote into his tally that the princess hummed like a ship horn and that the egg would hatch for her because she loved the sound of wind in her hair more than the sound of the court. He didn't sign his name, only drew a fish with a crown. A maester, the one assigned to attend her, wrote privately that he feared she treated the egg like a child and slept with it pressed to her belly. He keeps this censure in a small hand, and then, perhaps in an afterthought, adds a comparison to her husband, who visited the dragon pit at dusk and walked beneath the skulls for hours with a torch the color of honey, naming each beast as if reminding himself of a catechism he could not afford to forget. The first year passed. The second year drew in. There is always a tally of heirs. Wine-stained sums in a treasurer's book add and come to nothing. No cradle set at the foot of the royal bed. No proofs of fecundity to sell to wary lords. An edict announces a new levy on the harbor to improve the piers. Another closes brothels near the September. A fisher's wife mutters in a supplicant's petition that she prayed to the mother, but the mother wants offerings of lambs they cannot spare. A street singer improvises verses about a prince who laughs and a princess who walks the cliffs and the gods who keep their favors. The singer dies of something he caught in the black cells, and someone else takes up the tune. The prince lets his hair grow longer. The bride reads letters with a shell in her palm and writes back to a cousin on Driftmark that the city's smell cannot be changed even with a dozen bowls of salt. When the king sickens for a week and coughs blue and snotty into handkerchiefs embroidered with dragons, the hand decides to take inventory of the royal lineages to be ready with a chart should the need arise. A clerk copies names by candlelight until his eyes burn, and in the margins, a bitter note appears in another hand. A dragon must not be made to kneel before a chart. Once in the archive, a crinkled slip of parchment is wedged into the leaves of the great history of the realm, nearly illegible with seawater stains, bearing a sailor's scrawled words. He says he saw the princess step barefoot into the surf at dusk and hold both arms out to the jump of the waves as if measuring them. He says she spoke to the water, saying, "Ask me, and I will answer." It is unclear whether he meant she spoke to the waves or to her own belly. The maester's journal notes that the lady's hum woke echoes in the stone, and that the egg in her brazier rocked once at midnight and once again when the watch changed. A novice swept ash the next morning and swore the brazier hissed like a sleeping beast. But the egg never cracked. The dragon keepers tapped it, pressed it to their cheek, placed it in embers in warm sand under a hen. They made lists of the heat and the winds and the moon phase, wrote nothing different in the record than they had written for a dozen cold eggs before. When trouble is quiet, politics becomes a game of telling the story people fear the least. The Hand, Lord Mailer of the High Southern Tower, fostered a cautionary fable about patience. He wrote to Old Town and received back a vellum page on which a well-fed healer explained in careful lines that those of strongly mingled Valyrian blood were often late to breed. He read that page at the council and saw nods. The Lord of the Western Hills sent a golden goblet and a promise to drink to the health of princes when the gods allowed it. The Lord of the Green Isle wrote nothing at all, and instead sent a net filled with dead starlings to hang beneath the princess's window because his mother swore that such a charm would call fertility like wind calls a bell. The princess demanded the net removed, and a very small, very sharp edict directed that no one, not even a lord famous for his sea cunning, might hang anything dead from the windows of the royal chambers. In the court diary, written by ladies who liked to record who offended whom, a neat hand appends that the hand smiled like a priest at a feast, praised the edict for its tidy legal phrasing, and added a clause forbidding all charms and amulets and hanging objects, knowing even while he signed that when the babe came there would be charms everywhere and he would be able to fine half the city for them. The third year began with ice along the river and arguments over tariffs. A septa assigned to instruct the princess in proper piety wrote in her devotions that the lady wept not in the sept but on the stony beach, and that she tried to wean her from the hum the dragon keepers loved. She confides that the lady said, "Mother, I will be your daughter, but I will hum to call my child." The septa writes that she said, "You cannot use both faiths at once and expect either to answer." Then she confesses she took a small stone from the beach and kept it in her sleeve and rubbed it when her own prayers felt thin, which is perhaps why she did not last long in that post. The winter carnival at the capital is always tawdry and sweet. Candle booths drew young men to toss hoops, and a fat bull with gold-painted horns was paraded before the crowd. Somewhere in the confusion of juggling and soup stalls, a woman with a covered basket approached the princess and asked for a drop of blood. A squire knocked the basket away. He wrote his version of the story later in a wine-shaky hand, swearing a pale snake came sliding from beneath the basket cloth and that the woman meant to hex his lady. The woman protested she had a charm to ensure that when the lady lay with her husband next, they would be blessed. She had eel bones bound in red thread and a rhyme from a river which that required a smear of royal blood. This she admitted with a mix of reverence and salesmanship. The yeomen hurt her in their zeal. The court heralds did their best to assemble order from rumor. The hand had the woman whipped and sent out of the city, and for a time afterward it was not permitted to sell baskets near the palace gates or anything in a basket, or to be a person who was carrying a basket with anything at all under a cloth. It is the princess herself who ends the waiting without charms or baskets or correct prayers. A midwife of middling age confides to her sister that the lady sent for her in the dawn before a storm and said in her ear, "I have a secret you will help me carry." The midwife's testimony, taken years later just before she died, insists there had been no moon tea, no sorcery, only the stubborn knowledge of her own body, the tenderness that had shifted under her ribs, the early nausea that made her spit into the fire, the way she woke hungry as a soldier and slept as if a wave had carried her away. The maester's journal notes that the princess returned to Dragonstone in that storm with the egg she had warmed thrown into the sea and a new egg taken from the vaults in its place. He marks that storm as a bad omen because it lit the sky in ugly yellow, and no respectable storm should be that color. The captain of the royal galley makes a clean line in his log of the same night. He notes how the lady emerged at the prow and shouted at the wind in a language he did not know. Her husband stood behind her with both hands on the rope that held the ship to its course and smiled, as if he could trick the Black Sea into becoming a road. Perhaps he already saw the child who would run down that road toward him. The court gossips gleeful at last, wrote of nausea, of strawberries craved and then gagged at, of the king's brother's sudden kindness to servants and sudden absence from training yards, of the scent of smoke on the lady's hair from the egg warming so near. The hand insisted on silence until a quickening, and when the quickening came, he set a guard at every door and drafted a message to every lord, to prepare them for next spring's birth. It is here the first mistake was made. A clerk with nimble fingers and a quietly disobedient soul wrote to 3 lords of his own, copies of the hand's letter, but with a change, a suggestion the child already named in the mother's womb was heir to the iron seat and must be honored. He did this because he liked what clean succession makes of men. He did not think the world throws stones, especially at clean things. News took to the roads like fire to cut hay. The crown's banners arrived everywhere with the hand's careful language. The clerk's was right behind with its correctional zeal, and with him came newcomers of the court, whisperers and seekers of chances, men who spoke with the dazzle of those who had bet correctly once and meant to bet again. One of these was a minor knight in the service of the Hand's rival. He rode west and read the wrong letter to a lord who never forgot a slight and who had 2 sons the court had ignored. Another was a hedge priest who had been turned away from the capital except for singing badly and loudly about a dove and a thief. He hovered in the north and told everyone in a voice like a cracked bell that the crown had named a ghost to the throne. Is there anything people like better than a fight begun with a fine point of law? The Hand drafted a careful response and sent 100 copies. A scribe made twice as many more. The law, the Hand wrote, did not know the laws of a seaborn people, and it would learn them. He said there was precedent. He said the babe would be born in spring with the crown already sitting in the wind above it, and the realm would bow to a child properly introduced. He composed a second edict at the king's request that named the babe by a neutral style, Seed of the Dragon, and forbade anyone to raise banners on the unborn's behalf. The city guard popped nails out of their jaws when they heard that last clause because they had seen kings forbid the obvious and write their own invitations to riot. The edict was sealed in red wax, and a stick of that wax found its way to the mummers in Flea Bottom, who melted it to make candles and sang of the king's brother's seed and the city that waited like a widow. In white, a deckhand who moved cargo at the quays wrote in his palm book that slavers from the southern free cities had noticed the chatter and arrived with boys pale and fine, telling lies they thought would appeal to a court that loved silver hair and violet eyes, with dyed hair and honeyed lenses, but the court had grown too refined for such crude imitations. The Hand made a show of burning their boats. The princess, taught to hum for dragons, hummed for her child, and the egg in her brazier warmed and warmed. Winter cracked in two with a thaw that looked like hope. The princess wrote to her cousin that she could feel the child's heel, and that it was always the left heel that pressed, as if the babe had a preference for moving toward the shore. She told the cousin to tell the gulls she would bring a gull of her own. The cousin saved that letter and carried it in her bodice until she died, and when they laid her out, they found the vellum softened by breast sweat and salt and tears. The maester began to write in a hand that spills ink like blood. He writes that the babe was greedy, that it pulled the lady's food toward its own mouth through some secret cord, that the lady grew full-boned and red-cheeked though she could not climb the steps without panting. He writes that the winds turned and brought smoke from the east, and that there was word of trouble on the islands that marked the way to the free cities, and that men with old sharp faces and scorched thoughts had begun to whisper the crown would be weak if a baby issued from a woman came to rule. Into this moment stepped the prince's brother, who took to naming the unborn at the lance yard with a smirk, calling it little sea snow and sandfish, and then one afternoon, a bit drunken in the sun, calling it air as a joke to see who would flinch. The prince struck him on the mouth. The brother spat blood and flung it on the sand in a ribbon and said, "Truly, brother, how you have changed." There is a document signed by 6 men and a notary from the sept saying that afterward the prince apologized and the brother accepted. There is another document misfiled that says the brother swore in his heart to take a piece of something the prince loved before the summer ended. It was a year of omens. A comet appeared where none had been predicted and was seen at the same time in a sea lord's spyglass and in a child's copper pot filled with water. The child's nurse swore the pot omen had more weight because of her fear. "Fear is a magnet," she said, "and the Hand has no such magnet in his desk." The princess dreamed she stood on Dragonstone's ridge and saw a white bird rise from her belly and fly into a furnace. She wrote to her cousin, "I have seen my child. It is bright as the backs of fish." She wrote, too, that the dragon keepers had brought a second egg and then did not write who the second was for. The boy in the dragon keeper's hall, the one who drew a crowned fish, wrote a riddle in charcoal on a wall. What is born but never born? What grows but never grows? He did not write the answer beneath it. He simply left the question to stain the stones. A smith crossed himself when he saw it. A septon tried to scrub it off with oil and made the words darker. The day of the quickening's blessed festival, the Hand sent men into the city to collect charms. He took red threads from old women's wrists and burnt bundles of sage in the courtyard until even his own hair smelt of it. He announced he was not opposed to all charms, only to those produced by cell sorcerers without license, and that to respect women there must be order. He produced a licensed witch, gray and plump and with a laugh like rain on thatch, and had her bless a bowl of milk in the presence of the queen. A guard he did not trust carried the bowl. The guard later wrote that he had been given exactly one thing to do in his life and had gone to battle with less fear. The princess lifted the bowl and blew across its surface, and a ring appeared in the milk before it sank. The licensed which clapped and declared a crown would be seen in spring. A crown, not a helm. The city made its jokes and cheered its fate. In the alleys between taverns, men played at dice for whether the child would be boy or girl, and one very thin boy with a scar that involved his mouth bet all his coins on neither, and one because the dice were wicked and could be persuaded to lie if you leaned over the board with a certain patience. The babe slowed. The midwife whose sister heard everything reported that the lady no longer felt heels like gulls hitting the surf, that only a slow, fitful stirring remained. The maester wrote that this was normal and that the child was conserving strength. He wrote that to soothe the hand and to soothe himself, and to satisfy the expectation of a book in which outcomes follow the most elegant logic, and no cousin from the sea must be dragged into it, and no brother bent on a private vengeance, and no city with a taste for a word that tasted like air in the mouth. He rubbed oil into the princess's hands and told her the world loved her. He spoke like a man assembling a raft. At high noon on a day marred by air the color of ash, a midwife confides that the water broke not as a flood but as a spill. She says the lady did not cry out at first and walked to the window with her hands on the sill and watched gulls ride a wind that came from the east. She says the lord who had sworn to take something before summer sat in the yard with a cup of cold wine and an old woman from his childhood village, and that he looked into the cup longer than he should have. The princess labored and then labored more. The maester's journal notes he thought of every bell in the city tolling as a heartbeat he could not control. He writes how the pains began and how they did not develop in the way his lesson book promised. He writes how he set his jaw and said he would not cut, and then writes again that the lady asked him kindly to make the room quiet, and he realized he could not with the whole city outside crying air and the dragon keepers humming a dragon hum like prayer in their throats. All day the hands sent and received ravens. The replies were useless. Ride it out, say 3. Gods be with you, say 7. A warden of the storm lands writes, I am with you in the turn of the wrench that is not a storm, which earned him a gift later for the beauty of his sympathy. A sailor writes on the back of a letter that he could find not one fish in the bay that morning, as if the sea had thinned. In the small hours, the midwives began to argue. Warm oil, says one. Cold cloths, says another. The maester's apprentice writes that he knew the argument itself would kill them all. He is 20 and writes in the way of someone who wants the script of life to reward the man who notices it. The princess slept between pain bursts, her hands flat as if pressed to the sea floor. At last the child shifted in a way that does not herald hope. The midwife who had whispered that he was not breech now whispers that he is. The maester, who has promised not to cut, looks to the man who loves the woman and says he will keep his promise unless ordered otherwise. The prince stares at the wall. He touches the egg in the brazier with the back of his hand and takes it away when his skin hisses. The egg is warm, warm as her body. He does not know what warmth should be named now. He walks to the window, the same gulls, and then returns to the bed and says no, and the maester makes the sign of a doctrine that says no cut, no demon enters. An old woman in the corner, one of those paid to mutter prayers, mutters louder and says the demon is already here, but no one heeds her. A guard opens the door to call for hot water. The door knocks against the licensed witch, who has come unasked, and she places her hand on the hand's sleeve and whispers something that makes him jerk. He writes about that later and will not write the words she used. He says only that the words were true and hatefully small. The child does not come out living. The midwife's testimony is careful here. She says there was a moment when the babe came nearly far enough and then came no further and then went farther away. She says the princess said, a whisper of a thing, a sound like a gull's wing, I have seen you, and that the midwife held the mother and said, I have seen you too. The apprentice writes that he saw the hand cry at last and makes a note to call it a different thing in his memory. The maester writes that he sat down on the floor like a man who has carried a set of keys too long and no door will open for him. He writes that there was blood like contained fire. He writes that he knew, then, when he placed the cold, quiet child in the basin, that the lad who asked riddles in the dragon hall had known something none of them had known, and that the spell the boy said in charcoal on a wall was a simple spell of naming. This is when the prince said aloud the name they had not agreed on and let the hand write it down in the book of the royal dead without a birth date beside it. The egg cooled. It did not crack. A dragon keeper says he saw a line across it, a tiny disturbance, and that he rubbed it with his thumb, and when he looked again, the line was gone. Asepta took the child into her arms and told the mother she would make sense of this. And when no sense came, she was angry and then ashamed of being angry. She writes that she demanded from the god a something that sounded like a human waiting to be forgiven. She accused her god of being stone. She then writes an apology to stone. She writes that the mother did not hold the child long. The mother held the egg rather, and after a time, even the egg could not be born, and she put it aside and turned her face to the wall. The edicts begin. The hand's first is brief and states that the princess has miscarried. He chooses that word for public consumption. He says prayers will be said. He tells the city to respect quiet. A small cry goes up in the streets anyway because people must cry. They use it to know where their bodies end and their fear begins. Somewhere in the western quarter a door is slammed too hard, and a house falls. 50D. Their families demand bread. The crown bakes bread. The ovens glow, and there is warmth in the lower city. The baker who once saw the prince laugh begins to laugh inappropriately while he kneads and is dismissed, which looks like pettiness and is not. He scares children, and his hands cannot hold a knife. The hand's second edict declares the baby's name without the woman who bore it. He does this because he must remove weight from her, and because some of the lords he writes to still think names are only men's business, and because he cannot decide which men are more dangerous, those who believe in such things or those who pretend to. He writes that the babe Elrys has joined his ancestors in fire and twilight, and that the succession must now be considered with an eye toward order. He says in the third line that no man may raise the child's name as a banner and must respect that the realm will not be ruled by a child who was never born. In certain copies of this edict, copiers have added, who was never born. In one, the words are written larger, as if a clerk could save the realm by making a word big. The prince's brother leaves the city. He does not do it quietly, as that would ruin the effect. He gathers men and women who like to be seen gathering and rides out across the bridge to the southern gate with more noise than a wedding. Somewhere in the middle of the line, a girl sits astride a donkey with a pack of knives on her lap and keeps count of things that are counted. In the lines of her count appear the words bright and spare. His folly, their hunger, my knives. Out on the road, he speaks to lords who ignored him entirely when they thought he would be an uncle. He now promises he will be a father to them all and describes a child he does not have yet, birthed by a woman he will not marry yet, whose name he cannot guess yet, whose face changes each time he tells his tale. He promises that this child will grow rough and healthy and take the throne from his brother who has no child and does not deserve prayers. In the streets, songs change. A lamplighter hums the crushed melody of a tune about a gull and then stumbles on a stanza that says there are some lives one can feel and not hold. The little boy with the mouth scar writes a different bet on a different board, whether the hand would bury the little one with or without a stone. He wins again because the hand refuses a stone that can be prayed to. The child is burned by night. The ash is scattered into the sea from the cliff where the lady once stood to take measure. A clerk records the hour. The lady's cousin on the island keeps her candle lit until it drips down to nothing, then dips her finger in the wax and burns herself by accident and does not cry out. The maester closes his journal for 3 days and writes nothing and then opens it and writes a sentence on the 4th. I do not know what to name the space that remains. The palace changes. People pass each other in hallways and do not touch sleeves as often. The queen does not pick up her shell bowls for 3 months, and when she does, fully half of the shells have cracked in the dry air. The egg is returned to the vault and set into a cradle of sand. The dragon keepers leave a note on the vault door that says they do not believe in such a thing as never, because they have seen dragons hatch when no one believed. The hand has the note removed because it looks like insolence or hope depending on the angle of the light, and either way he cannot afford it. Factions that have learned to hold their breath exhale loudly in hidden terraces. The burnished. Those who favored the seaborn princess by virtue of her line to Driftmark's ships. mutter that the hand will turn this sorrow to his own purposes. The pale, those who stood to gain from the prince's brothers rise, whisper that the gods have signaled their choice. A third faction forms in the pot shops and dice houses, composed of people who like to see summer dancers tumble and like to climb trees and like to speak to dogs, who begin to say that the child, never born, governs them regardless. There are remarks carved into tavern tables. The little dragon spared us. There is another that says the little dragon cursed us. Fingers inked by night scratch counter-epigrams, and babies mule and doze oblivious because they are blessed with the privilege of not knowing what adults do in their name. The prince takes to the yard again. He breaks 3 lances in an afternoon and refuses the well-meaning attentions of men who want him to talk of anything but children. She writes in a memory she will tell aloud later that the princess brushed her own hair and said nothing when clumps fell out, and that when asked for a lock for a charm, she said, "All my hair is a charm," and then put the brush away. A midwife confesses in a different room that she keeps a bit of the baby's birth cord in a locket and will carry it until she dies. And when asked why, she says, "Because I must keep somebody." Spring resumes as if blood is not as weighty as sap. The prince's brother is encouraged by his echo and returns at the head of men who like to ride quickly. He cannot enter the city. The hand bars the bridges and holds a mass in the square where the bread ovens had glowed. He stands and says the realm must not forget its dead. He does not name the baby or the fault or the gods or the brother. He names only the duties of a state to itself. He writes that into an edict and has it copied in good ink. He also whispers to those who can be trusted to carry whispers that the realm cannot bear to see the woman who lost a child set aside for barrenness. Not now. He calls in favors and strings. He buys kindness with careful coin. He oppresses rumor like smoke in a jar. This is half of statesmanship, and he has always been good at halves. In a ledger of the harbor, a clerk marks that fewer ships go east that year. There is a trouble in those seas that licks the edges of carracks like a big cat. The clerk draws a little cat whenever he writes the word trouble. Someone scolds him for his levity. He later picks the better ink for his cats and draws them into the margins of important contracts. It is good to have some tiny portion of the world that you control and that does not die. The clerk survives another riot and another poor winter, and then dies of old age, and when they clean out his desk, 22 cats in different inks hide in the corners of the drawers. The dockworkers board up a door that mice liked because there is no one left to like the mice on their behalf. Lords arrive like weather. A lord with winter in his beard comes to stand with the prince. He brings a harp and sings songs of the dead in a voice you might lean your cheek against. The hand listens fr. OM a place behind a screen because he needs the music to ease the writing of his next edict and cannot be seen to indulge. A varder, a merchant from across the sea, brings cloth that turns color when moved, and also a rumor that someone in the southern cities has begun to speak of dragons as if they still mattered. The varder leaves with 2 small boxes of salt jewels carved like tears. He writes a letter home that says all the king's men weep like pressed olives. A nest of rats is found beneath the queen's bed. The housekeeper faints not because of the rats, but because the nest line, as a certain superstition would have it, looks like a line in the shape of a womb, and she takes this for a new omen. The queen sits on the edge of the bed and lifts a corner of the mattress and looks for a long time at the shadow where the rats lived. Then she instructs the mattress to be replaced. The housekeeper prays for a sign that this is a sign of nothing. In the log of household expenses for that month, unusual costs appear for rosemary, vinegar, and new reeds. The queen slips soup to a stray cat until even the hand notices and is kinder to her for it. The prince's brother makes his moment. He waits until the hand is at prayer and the prince is asleep at last, and rides under a white flag to the gate with a singer in his black and gold and a box of bright birds. He announces that he is there to swear his fealty. The city, always eager to not be the battlefield, tells itself this might be enough. He takes the oath. He kisses the prince on both cheeks. He opens the box of birds and lets them fly, and it is pretty. A boy claps. A guard writes in his margin book that he cried because he had a son once, and he thought the birds looked like his son's hands when he opened them out at the edge of the sea. The singer begins a song. When no one prevents it, the singer reaches the verse in which he mentions the never-born and the throne, and only then does the hand stir. He is slow because he has been afraid of exactly this flourish and had hoped he was wrong. He is never wrong in this. He says the singer must be quiet. The singer is not quiet. The guard who once carried milk for the licensed which steps forward, not for the law, not for the hand, but because he was given exactly one thing to do and this time chooses to do it himself. He breaks the singer's instrument in two. The brother laughs. There is a motion like air leaving a room. The prince says nothing. The queen walks out of the hall with her head high as a mast. The hand sends for the guard later and gives him a ring, and the guard sells it for bread for his sister's children, which is why the ring appears later on a finger with no right to wear it. There are letters now no one shows the queen. There are arrangements that bear linguistic resemblances to mercy and are called mercy in the books, because if they were called by their right names, the books would carry sickness. Fishers on the island write to each other that the lady who once measured their waves has not been seen. A broomwoman at the palace door writes that the queen's shape seems to have changed, as if the child had moved into her bones. A doctor of learning writes to another to ask if there is such a thing as an undone birth, a thing she names a negative birth where grief turns to body. The other writes back that there is the thing and that often it is too large to carry. A lord dies at table from something he did not know how to digest. A boy is caught writing, the little dragon will come back, on a wall, and is made to wash the wall with lime until his hands crack. He later leaves the city and becomes a goatherd and lives in quiet long enough to tell his grandchildren that line like a prayer. They take it for an old joke and love him for it. His grandson writes in a school paper that a never-born has the effect of a star. You can steer by it and never touch it, and yet it keeps you safe from rocks. People begin to tell stories about the never-born that edge into magic and then back. In one, the babe was seen walking on the palace roof at dusk, with hair like the color of a pearl. In another, the babe was seen in the reflection of a puddle, with a crown of reed and a voice like the wind in the high grasses. In a third, the babe was a gull, and in a fourth, a cat. The hand forbids the telling of the cat story. It gives hope, and he mistrusts hope the way he mistrusts cheap wine. He knows it will leave you thirsty and make you think thirst is your name. When the war comes, as wars do when a kingdom cannot decide what it wants to name its grief, it does not come with drums. It comes with a lack of fish and a lack of bread, and a lord persuaded in his cups that gods still prefer their offerings burnt, and a brother persuaded by a witch he did not know how to choose between, and a city that learned to sing too well about the absence in its middle. There is a battle in the marsh where men see their own faces in the water and let their enemies live out of terror at meeting themselves. There is a battle on the ridge where someone had once predicted a crowning, perhaps for a child that never crowned, and every man who dies there has a red smear down one temple, as if some unseen hand has anointed them. There is a battle no one can agree has even occurred, because it took place in the palace's nursery, in the dark, in a fight between two women who had once loved each other's children and now wanted to bruise something they could touch. The queen stood in the doorway and raised one hand to stop them and could not. She writes to her cousin that night and says, I am filled with something that has no name and moves me across the floors like wind moves a gull, and I cannot make the gull alight. The cousin writes back, I will come. Wreckers lure ships to coffins with lights at driftmark. When the cousin tries to cross, she drowns. They find her letter in her pocket. Water has sealed the ink into a blur the shape of a child's palm. All steel flung is not thrown for policy. Some is thrown like prayers. A runner who had once hoped to bear the baby in his arms carries instead the gold-braided standard of the prince and falls in the mud while still running. The men behind him do not step on the standard. There is at least that. A maester writes that it rained when it should not have. He writes that the books did not prepare him for this. He writes that wars over the naming of shadows are the hardest to end. He writes, and writing begins to quiet. They do not burn the brother when they catch him. They cannot. The prince looks at the man who is his brother and says, I would have been the same. The brother lifts his chin to invite the reply of steel, and the prince says, I would have been the same. The city expects something more emphatic. It receives his quiet instead, and quiet, in a city that has trained itself to interpret noise as strength, is a scandal. The hand writes an edict that turns quiet into law. He forbids the telling of lies about the never-born except those the crown tells. He forbids the making of ash figures that people have begun to mold and leave near the gates. He forbids, as if forbidding could gather back the wild thing of grief. And each forbid dance is written in a hand that grows more and more beautiful, as if to compensate for all the ugliness it must restrain. Beauty in letters is always a little suspicious. The queen goes to the sea. The maester writes that he despaired for her body, for it had not recovered, and that he asked her to wear furs, and she laughed. She walks to the water and wades in up to her hips and places something in the waves. It is not the egg that had already been returned. It is, the midwife wagers, the shell bowls her cousin had sent. It might be that she needed the smell to go away so she could smell anything else again. It might be that she wanted the sea to be in charge. A steward writes in the provisioning lists that the queen now prefers soup with eel. A boy sees her on the shore and writes that he counted how long she kept her face turned away from the city, and that at 100 he lost count, and that this is the first thing he had failed at counting, and he could never count right after. The war ends not with a treaty but with a failing of men's arms. They tire. People run out of brothers to send. The never-born remains unborn. It continues to exert its pressure on the blood, and after a time that pressure feels like weather, and so no one resents it the way they used to. The prince becomes the king. He is older now, and his hair has gone white at the temples. He smiles less but with more sincerity. He writes fewer letters and reads more. He says yes to less and no more often, and thanks the man who taught him to say no better than he might have done. He sits in the nursery sometimes with the door half closed and does not sleep there. He simply sits. A maid says she has dusted around him, and he lifted his feet for her and said thank you, and she nearly wept because even kings still have feet and can lift them for the housekeeping. An edict reforms the tariffs. Another honors dead small folk along with dead lords. A third names his brother guardian to a child of a man neither liked or admired. The city is not at peace, but it is at a kind of rest. Someone repairs a fountain and sets a carving of a gull at the lip and a carved wave under its foot, as if to keep it always landing. Years stack like plates. The maester dies. His apprentice becomes a man who writes less and better. In his abbreviated journal, he puts down what might be the right answer to the old charcoal riddle, not in words but in a drawing. A circle, empty and complete. The queen's hair grows dark with threads of other women's hair that she twines into her braids. She has no more children, though a dozen rumors run around the city pretending to be pregnant. She grows thinner and stronger, like a rope that has been pulled across many decks. She returns to the sea more often. She is seen sometimes speaking to the water. A guard writes that he tried to hear the words and heard only the sound of his own body trying to turn itself back into salt. When the dragon keepers die, as old men who have sung into hot stone die, a boy writes on the wall the riddle again. What is born but never born? Someone writes beneath it, you are. Then the words are whitewashed. Things are always whitewashed, and come through again in the damp like secrets returning to mouths. On the island, a child collects shells for the queen like an offering and trips and splits her knee, and the shells go everywhere, and the queen kneels and collects them too and speaks a small rhyme to the blood, and it slows. The rumor of that rhyme replaces a dozen more dangerous ones. People come to the palace to ask for their own rhyme. The queen will not sell rhymes. She keeps that one between her and the waves, which is how one keeps a true liturgy. There is one more attempt to make a king out of the brother. It goes badly because he has grown to love the role of the man who might have been king. He is more himself in exile than he would ever be in the chair. He realizes that truth and lets himself become the cautionary tale the hand had once tried to write into existence. He writes a book, gives it to a priest to hide, and in it places his confession, which is neither as blood-stained nor as searing as those who hate him might have preferred. He admits to letting a singer sing the wrong verse too loudly. He says that when he threw open the birdcage, he hoped the birds would not fly. He writes that when the little dragon died, he felt a heat on his throat and thought for a moment he had breathed fire at last, and then realized it was only his own shame. He does not share this book with the queen. He sends it to the sea. It never returns. The king grows sick, as kings do. He calls the hand and the queen and the men his father had loved. He says their titles. He names them as if in naming them he could make the shape of the kingdom hold steady once more. He refuses to name a child he cannot have. He refuses to pretend. He asks the hand to bring him the cracked shell of a large egg once warmed long ago in a brazier. And the hand brings him something smooth and unbroken and lies, because lies are sometimes what allows the night to be survived. The king places his hand on the smooth, cool thing and asks if it is cold. The hand says it is what it is. The king smiles. It is perhaps the old laugh, very faintly again. He dies with that nearly laugh on his mouth. They bury him at Dragonstone in a vault that looks like an opened egg. The queen does not sleep for 3 nights. On the 4th she sleeps and dreams of a bird that finally lands. In the generation after, when new dragons are rumored from nowhere, when men with different banners cry that they were promised fire and have instead been given weather, the story of the never-born changes shape once more. Children who have learned to count by the rhythm of waves are told of a prince and a princess and an egg that did not crack. A midwife says in a corner that things are always born whether or not they arrive, and that one must leave room in the counting for that. A court scholar writes an apologetic for his own youth in which he says that the world is big enough to hold absences, and that sometimes absence is the only honest king. A fisherman writes on the wood of his boat, simply Elries, and pushes out to sea. There is a law now, buried in a casket of other laws, which states that a babe still in the womb may be named heir if the realm calls for it, and may be honored if he does not arrive, and that no one may make a brother of the king out of this name. It is a silly law. It is a beautiful law. It sits like a pebble in the shoe of every man who tries to run fast to power. Sometimes the pebble saves him from falling over the cliff, and sometimes it puts him off his stride enough to be caught. The law is less important than the story. The story goes on. An old woman whose sister once cared for a losing mother sits by a window and looks at the sea. She has forgotten nearly everything except how to hum. She hums, and someone in the corridor outside her chamber hears it and pauses and hums as well. And soon the song of dragons and grief and soup and law and birds and bridges is moving through that palace like wind through grass. A boy with a scar that involves his mouth comes to the gate and says, "I would like to see the old woman." The guard says, "The old woman is seen by no one but herself and the sea." But he goes and asks anyway, and the old woman says yes, and the boy enters, and in the log of visitors a clerk writes, "A boy, a man, came who bet on neither and won twice and lost once after," and the clerk sets down his quill and rubs his hand because he too is tired. The boy tells the woman the riddle and waits for her answer. She smiles. She has none. He has none. The lack of answer is an answer that eases them both. Years later, in one of the rooms where apprentices look up old words for new uses, a broom catches on a crack in the floor. The crack has been there a very long time. The boy sweeping, now a man who does not know the age of the crack, steps back and thinks he hears something. He looks down and imagines a sound in the stone, the smallest one. He cannot be sure. He writes it in the margins. Today the stone spoke. He goes home and tells his child a story about a dragon that was never born and how, in not being born, it taught a city to count differently and to set down the names of its dead more tenderly and not to hang dead birds from women's windows. The child listens and falls asleep with the sound of that hum in their head. The parent sits a while and keeps the hum in the air. The parent suspects the never-born has become the city's oldest citizen. The parent suspects they would not know how to bear their lives without the company of this absent little king. The parent suspects such a thing and does not put it in any book because some knowledge is better kept humming than pinned. There is a rumor that the licensed witch lived long enough to see the sea change color, and that she laughed then in a new way and said the gods had at last sent her a joke she could enjoy. There is a rumor that the hand's desk splintered one night and out of the splinter came a splinter bird, a thing of wood and intention that flew as far as the court and fell, and they preserved it in a box like a saint. There is a rumor that a woman who had once laid a charm with eel bones in a basket washed ashore, and that an old guard carried her basket to a warm fire and gave her bread he had bought with a ring and told her he regretted the whipping. She forgave him before he finished the sentence, not because he deserved it but because she liked to sleep and forgiveness was the only blanket she had. If you go to the cliff on Dragonstone and place your hand against the stone, you will feel nothing but stone. If you go at dawn when a gull lifts off the lip of the rock and leaves its shape behind in air, you may imagine you feel a beating like your own pulse. If you drop a shell into the water, you might hear it strike. If you wait all the necessary years, if you teach your children how to hum lower than words and also how to read laws, if you tell them stories about what the city became when it learned the shape of its missing piece, you will see them grow with an empty place in them that makes more room for other people. The never-born puts a hollow in you that keeps you from overfilling yourself. The children will find their own riddles, and the only necessary answer will be this: that they can carry the absence without making themselves kings, that they can love a city that was taught tenderness by a little dragon who lived like weather, who crowded no tea. Roan, who sat like a pebble in the shoe of ambition, who set the quiet humming as a kind of law. And if some night a sound comes out of the vault like a line across an egg becoming a crack, you will not jump. You will say, of course, and turn your face to the sea and call the child by the name his mother chose in the hour when names all sounded as if the mouth could break on them. The sea will not answer. The air will move in the grass. The city will sleep. The gull will land. The dragon that was never born will keep the city company. In the first year without the king there were too many doors left open, and the drafts met in the corridors like old enemies. A footman noted that the candles guttered even when the windows were latched, and that on still afternoons the tapestries shifted as if someone on the other side were moving them with a careful hand. The Dowager Queen walked those halls as if they belonged to a story she had not finished telling. She laughed seldom and then only at something that remembered itself. A cat springing from a chest, a boy's whistle echoing across an empty courtyard. In a letter she sent to no one, tucked unsent into a prayer book, she wrote that she had become an organ pipe tuned to a wind that did not blow. She said it was a relief to go to the seawall where the air put shape back into her. The decision of succession was not announced to trumpets. The hand, who had traded sleep for ink so many years that sleep now owed him interest it would never pay, wrote privately to 4 lords and 1 lady who could steady a scale. A clerk penned copies on salted parchment, in case tears fell. They met not as a great council but as 5 faces reflected in a basin of wine, and in that wine agreed that a cousin from the island line would best make the realm forget the shape of its missing thing. The choice, a calm man named Varen with a wife who collected soft stones and a son who did not speak, was not a thrilling one, which is precisely why the hand insisted on it. The coronation was a morning affair, brief and without birds. The bells did not sing so much as cough. A minute edict, almost embarrassed by its own prudence, recorded that the crown had been set on the new king's brow in the sight of the realm, and that prayers had been offered for those who could not attend. The dowager redlined a phrase that would have burned incense for the never-born by name. She did not want a cult birthed for him by ink. There were those who wanted a fire regardless. A fishmonger with clever hands carved a tiny crown out of driftwood and danced it along the lip of his stall. A hedge priest raised his voice and said the little dragon had put a thumb on the scale and would press again if the crown forgot. The hand found a way to buy them bread without buying their voices. He devised the Feast of Lamps, to be held every year on the day the sea had been too calm to speak. He ordered the city's lamplighters to walk in procession from the docks to the sept, a line of ordinary flame to stand instead of extraordinary rumor. He ordered lanterns hung along the bridges and on the masts of the ships. The first feast passed safely, the lamps shaking as if head-shaking were a liturgy. A letter from a lamplighter's wife tells how their youngest fell asleep afterward with wax on his fingers and would not give up the stub until dawn. The Dowager Queen refused a new marriage. The hand asked with words that were dutiful and sounded like stones placed carefully in a river. A priestess from the island wrote that the sea married and remarried itself in tides, that grief had its own appetites, but that sometimes it also had sharp teeth, and the queen should watch lest it chew her to the bone. The queen wrote back, "If you see me thinned, understand I am rope and not candle." She did not forbid suitors. She merely outlived their patience without insult. The book in which the master of revels recorded hopefuls wept ink at the corners by harvest and was shelved. The hand died in his chair during a summer storm that struck the city with stubborn rain. The apprentice who had become a man instructed the servants not to move him for an hour, and in that hour the city changed its weather toward him. In whispers, the men in the yard called him the father who had kept them from running with swords into the nurseries of their neighbors. The bread sellers called him a customer with an inconvenient taste for yesterday's loaves. The Dowager Queen sat with him and hummed a note that stuck in the wainscot. The new king appointed a gentler man to the office, one who carried a handkerchief scented with orange peels and believed in saying please to his clerks. The laws became neater by a hair. A small book began to circulate without a cover. It bore the title Observations on the Tender Account and contained the apprentice maester's notes on how grief had shifted policy. He wrote that he had seen tariffs softened after funerals and taxes increased after songs. He wrote that the city had developed the habit of carrying the never-born before itself like a small and weighty saint, not to pray to, but to remind itself not to bustle past its dead. He observed, with some pride he later crossed out, that the prohibition on hanging dead birds at women's windows had been extended to fish in bottles, as if the law understood that despair also had the habit of being decorative. He included a copy of the edict that created a public right to the ovens 2 days after any disaster. He named the law not by its number, which was dry, but by its smell. A cousin of the first queen, a woman named Eleni who worried bread into crumbs when she thought, appeared with a wicker case. She wrote later in her journal that it was foolish of her to suppose that grief could be harvested like lavender. But she went on supposing it anyway. She had found the second egg, the one the keepers had told themselves belonged to no one, in a corner of tea. He vault where it had acquired a name in dust. She had braided sprigs of thyme and small shells into the wicker. The new hand nearly dismissed her. The Dowager Queen did not. She permitted the egg to travel, under guard, to an island hearth where, the keeper noted, the light kept slipping as if the fire thought of leaving. A boy was assigned to turn the egg daily. He did so with reverence until reverence began to itch, and he did it with mischief, singing wrong notes on purpose to see if the shell would object. The shell did not, or else its objection was recorded only in the book of some other creature. It was in those years that a journal reached the city from across the sea, a wet thing dried by herbs and diligence. It contained copied pages of a confession signed by the king's brother in a hand more honest in curves than in content. The sea had not kept it entirely. Portions were blotted into a language of mildew. If one held the leaf to a candle, faint sentences rose that might have meant anything. He had meant to break the instrument. He had meant to bend. He did not know how to want what was given. He apologized to a woman he did not name. The apprentice maester wrote in the margins that half-truths are more dangerous than swords because swords are, at least, forthright. The dowager did not read it. A steward put it beneath her supper plate and then took it away when she called for salt. The cult sprang anyway, in spite of prudence and lamp processions. 3 women in a washhouse began to tie off their mourning with a white thread and called themselves the Order of the Empty Crown. They never meant to be more than a comfort in the steam. A beggar, who had found a half-crown of brass and wore it hung on a string against his chest, began to preach at the edge of the fish market about honoring what did not arrive. A sailor stuck a circle of tin to the prow of his boat and wrote a yell without certainty that those were the right letters. The hand spoke an edict against meeting in numbers to discuss absent kings. The beggar argued that the edict itself proved the crown believed in the absent more than he did. The argument blew by day and went out by night. The hand bought him a woolen cloak and 2 loaves and told him to preach on the hill where the wind would steal his words and pass them into the grass. He agreed. He had always liked grass. The queen went sometimes with a single maid to the cliff where the ash had fallen. She took no bowl of shells. She took eel broth in a bottle and drank it on the verge where gulls counted the waves for her with their wings. A girl from the village who carried laundry up and down the hill wrote to her aunt that the queen smiled at her and said nothing and then, after a time, gave her a ring. The girl traded the ring for a cow that died of a cough in winter, and for a while she believed herself cursed. Only much later did she admit in her old age that the cow had already been ill, and that the curse, like most curses, was simply a story told to make grief proud. A letter arrived from the north, carried in the sleeve of a man who didn't trust ravens. It said that a child had been born who could not abide the sound of harp strings but calmed at the hum of a faraway train of wagons on the river road. It requested permission to adapt the city's rite of the lamps to the form of a lantern hung in a barn. The hand replied, for once with no legal ornaments, "Do as is kind." He also sent a jar of orange peel to the mother, because the scent had carried him kindly through nights. Sometimes there were almost dragons. A stable roof smoked on an island morning without cause. Children swore a black shadow passed over the yard that could not be a gull. A keeper recorded a rattle in a wall and then, shamefaced, caught an ordinary snake and removed it to the reeds. A cook burned her hand and dreamed of a green eye in a cradle of coals and wrote the dream down on the back of a recipes list. The queen asked for the list. She placed it beneath the egg and left it there until the grease spots turned translucent and then brittle. She did not tell anyone why. She had learned to keep some ceremonies gummed shut by her own saliva. The new king took little interest in eggs or cults or laws dressed as hymns. He liked the work of boats and measures. He cut 5 feet from the end of a long pier because the last planks were rotten and wrote in his own hand that boys were not to swim for bets in the floodgate. He had seen too many boys go down with their mouths open, as if the water were a confession it had to make loudly. He held court even with rashes on his neck and a ladle in his hand from having stirred stew while the kitchens mended a ceiling. He told his men not to bring him songs about absent kings. He said presence was a song to be sung in a key the living could manage. Yet he did not chastise the lamplighters' procession. He walked in it once, without crown, carrying a child's lamp attached to a string. A woman waved from a balcony and cried as if she had seen a miracle equal to any hatchling. In one brief winter, a winter of chains on the river and men using their breath as a kind of broth, an old man claimed to have seen a flame shape in the glass of the ice. He scraped at it with a broken plate and lifted out a thin sheet like a page, with a flare trapped within. He carried it into the city. By the time he reached the market, the trapped fire had either escaped or evaporated or revealed itself as a trick of brightness. He sold the sheet to a boy for a song, and that boy used it as a window for a tiny house he built for worms. There is a line in a ledger that simply says, "Fire and ice, worm house window, 1/2 penny." The hand underlined it. He underlined nothing else on that page. A note in the apprentice's journal, in a practiced brevity, records a quiet change. He wrote that the law permitting a babe unborn to be named heir in necessity had been amended by a CLA. Use requiring 3 seasons worth of calm between wars. He wrote that it was either genius or cowardice, depending on the lamps. He wrote that each word pulled like a stitch in thick cloth and that the cloth moved only because the whole table was heaving. He drew a little fish wearing a crown, without realizing he had repeated the boy's old image. He did not sign his drawing. He closed the book. The boy who used to make bets on neither grew into a man who kept accounts for men who preferred gold to facts. He married a woman who carved spoons with gulls on the handles. They had a child with a laugh that set dogs barking in delight. He wrote a note at the bottom of a bill to the palace kitchens about what the queen had taught him when she took off her ring and gave it to a washerwoman. That value wore disguises, and that grief made us paperwork if we were not careful. The cook who received the bill folded it into a small triangle and kept it in her apron, which is why it was still there when she fell into the well. She did not drown. Even the well had learned restraint. The egg warmed when no one looked. A guard confessed to his daughter that he had seen it on a dawn when his relief slept in his chair, that he had entered the vault against his orders and placed his palm on the shell and felt a gentling like a cow's tongue. He did not write it down. His daughter later described the way he pressed his hand to his knee when he told the story, as if his palm carried a residue of heat and he dared not offer it to air. When she was old, she whispered that when he died he smelled faintly of soot and thyme. She tucked a thyme sprig into his coffin and did not tell the priest because she did not wish for permission for the only right thing she would ever do. The new hand, softer, scented with oranges, found himself hardening. He ordered that any stories of a return would be fined not because they were untrue but because they were lazy. He insisted the city speak precisely. Not the little dragon will return, but we will continue under the shape of what we lost. The scribe who drafted the edict for public consumption made it prettier and, in making it prettier, reduced it to wind. The hand tossed the fair copy into the brazier and then, in an exhaustion he had not expected to feel before old age, leaned and rested his forehead on the mantle and smelled a little like the boy's father when he died. It was only a moment. He straightened. He asked for more oranges to be dried above the kitchen fire. He wrote letters to the port, where the cat-drawing clerk had died with cats in his desk, asking that the next clerk draw nothing at all in margins and see if that quieted the river. On an island summer afternoon, the queen gathered children on the steps of the old watchtower and told them a story in which a girl found a hollow stone and carried it like a cup. The story ended without the cup being filled. A child asked, "When?" The queen said, "I do not know." The child said, "But a story must say when." The queen said, "I promise there are stories that do not," and the child, "This will be his lifelong gift," considered and then nodded as if this could be true in a different shape than the shape he wanted. After that, afternoon songs changed again. Sailors sang about cups. A man with a glass eye, who preferred it to his old eye when storms came, wrote lyrics in which the cup, when left empty, caught not water but wind, and when raised to the ear could report on the weather to come. Boys lifted shells and told each other they were listening to the never-born's whisper, but what they heard was the old sea, tired and implacable and sometimes kind. A priest got it into his head that the wind in a cup was the same as the breath in a body and declared a theory of souls that involved no ladders, only hollows. He was unsurprisingly dismissed from the September. He took his theory to the hill, shared bread with the beggar in his wool cloak, and founded, against his own wishes, the most cheerful sect in the city. When illness came, it behaved like a learned man. It read the city first, decided what ruse would serve it best, and wore that mask until it was bored. It came at first in a cough that spoke politely and then refused to leave. It came next as a fever that colored ears and fingers and taught people to speak only in thickened whispers. A midwife confides that the fever sounded like the sea reciting to itself. The ovens glowed for days, free by law, the bread steaming like clean hair. The king himself stirred broths until his rash flamed and the hand put him to bed. A cleric writes that the bells rang not for death but to help people count their breathing. The queen tied strips of linen to the gates, one for each recovered, and when a boy asked why she would celebrate the living to such ceremony when the dead got only a name in a book, she said, "Because it is harder to love the living while they are still here." This is what the apprentice wrote down for her. It is the only sentence from her mouth in any official thing, and even then it is not hers and never resolves into anything so gross as a quote. Still it holds. The illness took her hair in a fortnight and her strength in a month. A woman who washed sheets for the palace wrote that the queen learned to tie her scarves with an elegance that made her the envy of women who had nothing to envy. An old guard, the milk-bearer, stood at her door and told a child who asked that no, she did not wish for more broth, that she had learned to prefer sour milk, that the body sometimes desired a slight curdle in its comforts when it meant to stay and not go. The queen wrote one more letter to no one. It said the sea hums when frightened. It said the body does too. It said if you hear your own humming, do not scold yourself, you are not a pot. She slept and woke and took longer to return each time, like a tide in its old age. Near the end, when endings are a thing pop. Lu cooperate with out of fatigue, the second egg cracked. It is the simplest sentence in the world and the most dishonest, because a word like cracked implies a drama that did not occur. What happened, according to the boy who turned it then and had learned patience and had grown, was that a line appeared and then a second line and then nothing for 17 days, and on the 18th a softness a finger could make into a dent. He wrote the dates in the margin of a practice text on declensions and forgot to write the year, so arguments about when the event occurred will occupy musicians for generations. The Dowager Queen was carried to the hearth. She placed her fingers into the old warmth, and out of the dry thing came a sound like an idea trying to sharpen itself. The air went smaller. The boy said he was afraid to breathe. The queen said, "Then do not," and he held his breath until his blood thumped at his wrists. He did not see the creature at first. It was all juice and limp tongue and beginning. The keepers cradled it as if whatever it was could leak. One said aloud, "Too loud, a beginning is a kind of ghost." Another said hush, as if shushing a flame. The creature did not die. It did not thrive. It lay in the warm and stared and opened and closed its mouth in the manner of a small thing that does not yet know the world is larger than a mouth. It was not handsome, which comforted everyone, especially the hand. The queen reached 2 fingertips across a span of darkness and put those fingers beneath its jaw and hummed. The keepers raised their heads and hummed. The boy hummed because he wanted to be inside whatever this was, and the thing lifted its neck and blew a thread of steam no thicker than a hair. If you ask now, men will demonstrate with their lips parted and their tongues carefully placed between their teeth how thin the steam was. They will argue about the scent. Smelled like cooked thyme, says one. It smelled like the first day of school, says another, unhelpfully. A woman who burned her hand long ago said it smelled like a kitchen between bread and meat. She was not thanked for her poetry. The queen lived 8 days beyond that breath. A midwife writes that 8 is a chain number and makes it neat. A boy, superstitious from birth, took off both shoes at each doorway and swore no devil could walk where he walked unshod, and no devil came. The queen wrote nothing more and needed nothing more. She died with her hands clean, no ink, no ash. The apprentice wrote only a circle in the margin and did not explain. The king's hand shook when he signed the edict that announced her death. A clerk kept that sheet for himself and later sold it for bread when he found himself poor. He went hungry anyway. The city hung white cloths and did not breathe loudly for a week. People spoke in the soft voice reserved for cupboards and sleeping babies and lambing ewes. The licensed which sat on a step and laughed under her breath. Not for joy, for relief that a knot had tied at last. As for the creature, it kept being a creature. The king ordered it nourished and hidden. The hand insisted on study. The keepers suggested that study and hiding were the same thing, which was a cleverness that made the hand want to promote and banish them simultaneously. The creature took warmth and seldom moved. Its eyes opened with an effort. It made 3 sounds in its first month. One that sounded like a cup set down, one like dry moss rubbed between fingers, and one that scared a woman into dropping a jar of oil and sent the guard into the yard to be sick. The last sound was not a roar. It was restraint failing and then catching itself at the edge. The boy wrote in his ragged hand, "I heard a self decide to stay." He folded that note into the pocket of his shirt. He would put it through the laundress's hands 100 times and it would not blur. No one called it a dragon. Nothing so much dignity was permitted it. The edict that established its name allowed a circle. The word used in the edict was the same for a coin and an egg and a ring, which comforted the hand, because ambiguity is an anchorage when seas are ashamed to be read. In private, people called it he or she as their tongues preferred. One boy liked it for the gap in his life where a brother would have been. A woman liked it for the sound her own grief made when it slipped into sleep. A man who had once bet on neither had the oddest contentment. He whispered to his spoon-handle gull that he had been right after all and then refused to gamble ever again. The order of the empty crown divided in kindness. Half of them folded their white threads away, feeling that the cup had been filled and that their work was done. Half knotted new threads and said that the cup had been transformed into the instrument that would teach the city restraint in a new register, one that could sing hot. A few left the washhouse and went to see if the sea would name the creature for them. One returned with salt in her hair and said simply that sometimes water knows and sometimes it does not. They went on washing and did not expect applause. The city learned a new etiquette around the vault. Humming was allowed if done softly and only in even breaths. Running was forbidden. Laughing was permitted at a distance provided it came from the heart and not from mischief. Touching was not permitted unless invited by a keeper with the authority to invite. Behind the creature's cradle hung a piece of wool cloth embroidered by 3 island girls who had never met. They stitched gulls landing and gulls lifting and a boy's hand in a guard's and a ring that could be a crown or a basket with nothing in it. One girl picked a green wool that had a strand of black in it and used it for the waves. Her mother scolded her for her poor eye and then, when she saw it hung there, cried because that was exactly the color they had imagined the night the ash fell. War with the East began as always, with men in the West imagining they were lonely. A free company sent letters to the king offering a trade. Men for salt, swords for laws with more spaces between words. The king declined with a grammatical flourish that delighted the apprentice. The company hired itself elsewhere and returned later with the look of a dog that had found someone else's field to ruin. They burned a little, broke a little, and were refused the battle they craved. A lord from the marches, too fond of noise, wrote the king a furious plea to meet them in bright field. The king did not. He wrote back that the bright field is for weddings, and several men had the good sense to be ashamed of having wanted to kill where they had kissed. The creature breathed twice in that season. Once when a wounded man bled nearby, and once when thunder shook a shelf loose. There was a moment when the creature lifted its head and looked a man in the eye. The man, a keeper who had once carved a fish with a crown and had in the intervening years forgotten he had done so, froze as ink in winter. He later wrote that he felt seen down to his poor tooth and his tendency to hide bread in his sleeves. He also wrote that being seen had not cured him of anything and had not killed him either, and that he thought doctrine should make use of that fact. The priest asked him what he meant. He said the seeing did not save him, but it kept him. The priest, who had run out of room to keep things, nodded without writing it down. A small scandal took hold in the kitchens. Someone began to draw circles in the flour on the baker's table. The baker accused his rival. The rival was away for a funeral. The baker accused the boy who kept accounts. The boy swore on a spoon. The queen's girl-maids laughed and drew more circles, and the baker accused the queen, but then remembered himself and apologized to a door. In the end, it was the cat that had licked the flour and left her face around and around. Cook declared this a miracle. The hand declared it a cat. The baker declared it a new kind of loaf and began to score circles into his crusts and could not keep up with the orders for them. Some nights the vault smelled like burnt oranges. The hand was embarrassed by the coincidence. He stopped drying peels above the fire and took to chewing mint. The creature did not like mint. It hissed a small hot tea of a hiss and then slept. An archive clerk, who had previously drawn nothing in margins, drew a leaf when he recorded the incident and then hated himself for the leaf. He tore the page out. The apprentice found the torn page in the waste and pressed it flat and returned it to the book and wrote beneath the leaf, "One ought only to be ashamed of ugly leaves." He smiled when he wrote it. He rarely smiled when writing. The smile made a damp on the page that later scholars mistook for a tear. This, then, was the shape of the realm in the years after the 8 days. A king who refused pointless battles and loved peers, a hand who tried to replace symbols with citrus and failed just enough to remain honest, a city that held its breath in a vault, a creature that breathed as if deciding whether to say yes, a dowager queen asleep under stone that in certain moods felt like an egg itself, and a people who dared to speak precisely about what their dead had taught them. The law mandating the opening of ovens after grief became so ordinary that no one remembered who had written it. The Feast of Lamps became less tense and more beautiful. The beggar took to sitting on a bench instead of a doorway and sang songs with a voice that had learned to be thin and pure and without stickiness. Children went to the cliff and counted not the waves but the pauses between. And sometimes, when the air felt like glass, you could stand on the highest place in the city and hum, and feel an answer unheroic and exact, from somewhere below where the stones were warm. A letter from the island speaks of a girl who stands in the laundry steam and knows when the creature breathes. She can tell from how the sheets rise. She is not magic. She is just attentive. A boy who climbs onto roofs to coax stuck swifts back into air complains to his mother that the creature has taught people to be methodical and he prefers when the city is dramatic. He grows up and becomes a cobbler with no flair and a happy family. Not all stories need better shoes to go on. During a storm in which lightning wrote a cumbersome script across the entire span of the sky and then crossed it out with rain, the vault door opened of its own accord and then rebuked itself and closed with a shrug. The keeper on duty sat down on the floor and kept his head in his hands for a long time and then wrote it up as a misaligned hinge. The hand read the report and underlined misaligned and then underlined hinge and then underlined nothing for a week out of modesty. A guard, perhaps the only honest witness, told his wife he had heard a whisper like a page turned in a quiet room. His wife, who did not believe in mending that was not done with thread, kissed him on the mouth and said she was glad his metaphors were improving. The creature shed its first skin. It looked like a damp glove discarded by a careful witch. The keepers were solemn. They imagined linen for reliquaries and a glass case and a rope to keep the curious from touching. The king put the skin in the sea. He did it with a sigh and no ceremony. A boy on the shore netted it out again and draped it over his head and ran through the rain yelling that he was the storm. He was not. He was a happy boy and later a happy man and then a tired old man and then the sea kept the glove after all. There were enemies who learned to talk about hollows as if hollows were weapons. A claimant with 3 vowels in his name, all in the wrong place, wrote a treatise that argued the realm had grown feminine and thus weak, that its attention to what was gentle had unstrung its bow. He set an army to marching. They marched in good order and ate each other's bread with respect and arrived with their boots polished to perfection. The king sent them home with contracts for pier repair. He said he would pay them well and on time. They argued that war was nobler. He replied that nobility was in contracts kept. Some later called it cowardice and some called it a long cleverness. But the peers stood after, and the men who would have died taught their grandchildren where to drive posts where the worms could not find them. A registry that once held only names of births and deaths added a 3rd column. It was labeled Days of Pause. A clerk noted the afternoons the city tilted toward listening for a sound from under stone and did not make excess noise. There were few such afternoons. One every season was plenty. The column took on dignity. A widow laid her palm on that page once and said thank you to men who could not hear her across the years and leaves. The clerk did not erase the smear. At last, when the creature learned to walk the length of itself and then twice the length of itself and then the width of a room, a keeper cut his thumb with a knife and held the thumb out. The creature considered and did not burn him. It touched his thumb with its mouth, an inelegant mouth, and the keeper cried like a lamb for a reason he did not understand. The hand gave him a bowl of oranges and told him to go outside. The keeper took 2 oranges to the widow who liked the registry and 1 to the beggar with the cloak and 1 to the girl who listened with sheets. He kept the last for himself and ate it on the steps of the vault and said aloud, "I am full." He was, of what, his wife asked later. He said, "I am ashamed to say this." She said, "Say it." He said, "Hope." She forgave him his embarrassment and permitted him to keep it. In that household, hope was finally counted as a food and rationed like bread in lean winters and celebrated like stew when meat was plenty. When a woman tried to carry in a basket a handful of eel bones bound in red thread and a rhyme, this time as an offering, not a bargain, the guard at the inner door shook his head with the kindness of one who had once carried milk. She said the rhyme anyway, and the hand, who had grown to be older than his oranges, laughed and wrote it down because it contained the correct number of beats. He filed it beside the edicts concerning the ovens. The apprentice, now old, placed a pebble on that file as if to weight down a boat. In the end, the city did not crown the creature. It did not set it to heraldry or carve it on coin. It did not forbid its name, and it did not sell it. The king aged without peace and with a consistency that, in other countries, would have been named dullness and here was called gratitude. The beggar died in his cloak with his brass half-crown hung around his throat. The queen slept in her egg-shaped stone and perhaps dreamt of gulls always landing. The boy who turned the shell became a man who placed the creature's meat before it and sang the wrong notes on purpose only every other time. The hand wrote one last law in elaborate penmanship restraining men from calling to themselves the fates of the unborn to excuse their cruel economies. It is not a famous law. It is a useful one. A priest on a hill taught boys to lift cups and listen for wind and then to go wash bowls. The creature learned to climb a set of stairs. It did it when no one watched and left 2 faint prints in dust at the top. A maid knelt and pressed her fingertip into one and whispered, "Hello." She fainted, not because of terror, but because she had been holding her breath all her life and forgot to exhale until then. The maid's sister returned her to air. The apprentice wrote a circle in his book and breathed out a long breath and then, for the first time in years, fell asleep at his desk with his head on a page and dreamed of a sea that did not need either prayers or law to keep from swallowing children. He woke and wrote his dream down badly and then felt better and then worse and then better again, which is the true shape of any tide. If you went then to the cliff at Dragonstone and held your hand out above the water, you might have felt a heat that was not the sun, not near your palm, not near your wrist, but very far beneath, like a kiln fired in an older age still cooling. You might have hummed a note you learned from a woman who learned it from a keeper who had once learned it from a cowardly boy with a good ear. You might have heard nothing and gone home filled with a new honesty. You might have heard a sound like the empty ring of a cup set down on a wooden table after company leaves, which is not sadness so much as hospitality resting. You might have seen the gulls land. You might have imagined a circle under your feet, very large and very patient, and named it the king you deserved. And if that circle's lifted, if one day the city stood and found a shadow that taught it to count new shadows, it would not be a correction. It would be an answer to a question a boy wrote on a wall in charcoal long ago and never bothered to erase. A keeper would stand with his hands clean and his thumb scar no longer tender. A hand would underline nothing and take a walk. A queen would stay asleep. A king would go to his peers. Priest would wash his bowl. A beggar would shrug into his wool and share his bread. A boy would open his mouth to laugh and dogs would howl for the joy of hearing it again. And the city, which learned tenderness from a small absence and patience from a smaller sound, would let the new noise in without making it a god, because it had already learned the most dragonless of magics, which is to continue together after.